Oracle partitioning methods. We've discussed Oracle partitioning in general in this course already. Now I actually want to look at the methods by which partitions are created. There are a number of different methods. As you can remember, partitions are physical divisions of data, splitting, for instance, a single large table into multiple pieces based on a partition key. The partition key is the thing which you use to split. So we can split by range, for instance 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, etc. By list value we can say, okay, all states on the west coast are in one partition, all states on the east coast are in another partition, etc., etc. Hash key separation essentially calculates where rows go in different partitions based on a hash calculation. There are also composite types of partitions. There are two types, which is a range partition containing a hash division and a range partition containing a list division. Now let's look at the syntax of creation of partitioning and partitioning methods in some detail. The point to note about partitioning is there are some things, generally minor, that you can do to tune individual partitions, but the major point is that creation of partitions and using of Oracle partitioning is a tuning method in itself. In other words, when you change a table from a single table into a partition table, breaking it up into pieces, you're actually doing a tuning process. You're actually tuning the database. So, very simply, create a range partition. You create a table. I've given it a name, shows by range, and you partition it by range based on a single or multiple column values. And here you can see I've actually got partition P1, values less than a certain date, goes in one table space, and then values less than another one, greater than this one, less than this one, go into P2, TBS2, etc., etc. The final partition asserts that all values up to the maximum value, in other words the highest value of show date in the table, go into the fourth partition, table space 4. In that case I've called it partition N for any number, and I've labeled that as table space 4. The last partition takes all values greater than, in this case, the third partition and up to maximum values. By list simply says partition by list based on a column called state. In this case, partition 1 is California, partition 2 is Nevada, and partition 3 is New York. And here I'm splitting up my shows table based on a hash value calculated on the show ID, and I'm describing it as being split into 4 separate partitions and stored in these 4 separate table spaces. All it's going to do is it's going to use the show ID to calculate some kind of hash value and plop it to separate 4 partitions based on the result of that hash value, dividing the values in the separate partitions equally. So what I mean by equally, remember, a range partition lets you set a range column value. The same as a list, it sets a list value. The advantage of using a hash partition over that of range or list partitions is that by virtue of the fact that the hash calculation and the decision of where to put each row, in other words within which table space or which of the partitions of the 4 defined here, is decided by Oracle database. In other words, each partition is very likely to have an equal number of rows. In range and list partitioning, that is unlikely unless you examine and monitor the content of your data very thoroughly and regularly. Here's a composite range hash, which basically contains a range partition based on show date and then sub-partitions which are divided based on a hash value. So I would have partition by range, sub-partition by hash, and then sub-partitions and where I store the hash sub-partitions. So each partition is defined as being less than a date value with sub-partition hash values placed in 4 sub-partitions within each of those table spaces. A composite range list essentially defines sub-partitions within each range partition.